Mud. A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Ananta Koti Vaishnavrinda ki jai. Namacharya Srila Haridas Thakur ki jai. Prem Sakho Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasari Gaur Bhaktavrinda ki jai. Shri Shri Radha Krishna Gopa Gopinatha Shama Kunda Radha Kunda Giri Govardhan ki jai. Shri Vrindavan Dham ki jai. Mayapur Dham ki jai. Jagannath Puri ki jai. Ganga Mai ki jai, Jamuna Mai ki jai, Tulsi Maharani ki jai, Bhakti Devi ki jai, Samaveda Bhaktavrinda ki jai. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to Shri Shri Guru and Gauranga. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. Today we're continuing the reading of Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita, Volume 1, Chapter 9, entitled A Resident of Vrindavan. Srila Prabhupada now, it's around October of 1958. On an October visit to Delhi, Abhay received a donation from Kaviraj Baidyanath Sirkar to be used for printing 1,000 copies of Back to Godhead. Abhay promptly produced an October 20th issue of Back to Godhead with the donor's name on the front page. It was the first issue in 2 years. So we have here the archives. They collected all of Srila Prabhupada's original Back to Godheads, and this is that edition of October 20th, 1958. And way down here at the bottom, there's one little line where Prabhupada writes, 1,000 copies donated by Kaviraj Baidyanath Sirkar of Delhi every month. Now, along with this, because October 20th, Prabhupada had just returned from Bombay, and very quickly he printed this Back to Godhead magazine. At the same time, Prabhupada was doing other writing as well. He was writing essays. And he wrote an essay specifically dedicated to Vaidyanathji. And the name of that essay was Shakti Puja. Because it turns out that in Bombay, not in Bombay, in Bengal, we've heard about before about the Bhadralok, the Bengal Renaissance. Because the English had made their capital in Bengal, and specifically in Calcutta, it was the first place outside of England where they instituted Western education. So the Bhadralok, or the gentlemen, the higher society consisting of the Brahmins, the Kayastas, and the Vaidyas, the Vaidyanaths, the physicians, they got very good education in Calcutta. And they were the Bhadralok, very highly educated. Also in Bengal, we know that there were two classes of religionists, and that was the Shaktas and the Vaishnavas. And the Shaktas, they followed Shankaracharya's Panchopasana. And that was, they also might have worshipped Vishnu, but they could choose amongst any five, Shakti, Shiva, Ganesh, Surya, or Vishnu. Worship any form that they were attracted to, but ultimately, it didn't matter which form they worshiped because the supreme is Brahman, or impersonal. So this was the Shakta worship. And then the Vaishnav worship was the four sampradayas from Sri, Rudra, the four Kumaras, and Lord Brahma. So Sri Baidyanath, Kaviraj Baidyanath Sirkar, he was a devotee of Shakti. But being Bengali, he also understood about Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. So he was actually on the path to becoming a Vaishnava. And he wrote poetry. And he gave Srila Prabhupada one of his small books of poetry. These poetries were glorification of Shakti. Now, we also learn in our philosophy of Vaishnavism about Vishnu Tattva and Shakti Tattva. So their concept of Shakti Tattva is that it's the power and the powerful. Just as we understand, there's Vishnu and then there's his energies. And each different form of Vishnu has the corresponding energies. But they understand that this energy to be equally as powerful as the Supreme Lord. And they consider Radha, Sita, Lakshmi to just be another one of the Shaktis, corresponding to Ram, Narayan, Krishna, etc. But Vaidyanathji, he could understand that in this day and age, Srila Prabhupada said that in his last poem, Vaidyanath's last poem of the little book, he actually gave the entire message of Srila Prabhupada's Bhagavad-Gita. Because Vaidyanath understood that in this day and age, very few people are interested in returning back to the Supreme Lord, back to Godhead. And he even used the phrase, back to Godhead. But the Lord is so compassionate that he himself comes, or he sends his different avatars, his representatives, just to call the people back to him. And he said, in this age, one does not have to go to the hills, to the mountains, perform severe penances. All you have to do is call out the names of the Lord. And that way you can get salvation and return back to Godhead. And he gave the example of now, in this age, Nimai of Nadia has appeared. And we should all follow his instructions by going door to door and recalling the forgotten souls and bringing them back to the Supreme Lord. Now, this is when Srila Prabhupada read this poem of Sri Sirkarji, he was so appreciative that here is a fellow Bengali, actually a fellow devotee, who understands this message of the Back to Godhead magazine. So much so that he donated for 1,000 copies to be printed. Now, for 2 years, Srila Prabhupada was not able to print the Back to Godhead magazine. He was in Bombay, attempting in other ways to preach. Now, with this donation, he could very quickly print the next edition. And he did not print that Shakti Puja article. Many of the essays that Srila Prabhupada wrote, and these are all handwritten, that were later discovered at the Radha Damodar temple. Many of them we sent to the archives, they preserved them, they're keeping them in vaults. We used to have them on display here, but because of the bad weather, we sent them all to the archives, because here with the heat, with the cold, with the moisture, they would all be destroyed within 50 to 100 years. So they're in the archives in America, in a part of America called North Carolina. They have these huge vaults, and they keep perfect temperature, so that Prabhupada's handwritten articles and all of his typing things, everything about that Prabhupada published by hand, are being kept in these vaults to preserve for hundreds and hundreds of years. So what Srila Prabhupada did in this issue of Back to Godhead, you see here, if you can see, the first article is Prayers of King Kulashekar. Now, the prayers of King Kulashekar, called the Mukunda Mala Stotra, are very famous because he was the 10th Alwar at Tirupati, at the Ranganath temple. He was the king in the 9th century of Malaya Nadu, which is now called Kerala. He was a great devotee of the Lord. And one night, he had a vision. Sri Krishna appeared to him. and he went into trance. And when his ministers and singers came to wake him in the morning, he didn't respond. So they very carefully opened the doors, and he came out of his trance. And from that time onwards, he lost all interest to rule. He abdicated his kingdom, and he went to Rangakshetra to worship the Supreme Lord. And there he produced the Mukundamala Stotra in Sanskrit. And Srila Prabhupada was very fond of some of these stanzas. He would quote them quite often and sing them as well. So Srila Prabhupada began the translation of the Mukundamala Stotra. He took the Sanskrit edition that Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur had used from 1895, before Prabhupada was born. And he began that translation because Prabhupada was perfectly proficient in Sanskrit. And we have now the book, Mukundamala Stotra. But Srila Prabhupada personally handwrote only the first 6 slokas. And he gave such an elaborate purport that in this Back to Godhead, the first page and then running onwards, every single article that Srila Prabhupada wrote, he never completed in one Back to Godhead. It was always to be continued, so that you would read the next issue and the next issue. So the same with the prayers of King Kulashekar. He just gave a fraction, and that fraction, it can take you 1 hour to read. But his elaborate purports were so perfect. Every single word, explanation, the different names of the Lord, what they mean, why Kulashekar used them. And we're given just a taste of this first sloka. And then, after doing just the first 6 slokas, Prabhupada stopped translating. But because he had to spend time on his Srimad Bhagavatam. But when Prabhupada printed the Srimad Bhagavatam, the first 3 volumes, at the front of each book was a list of the books that Srila Prabhupada had written. And one of them was Mukundamala Stotra, although it was incomplete. So in 1989, the GBC, they decided that now we have proficient Sanskrit editors. We should complete this because this was very dear to Srila Prabhupada, and it was one of the books that Prabhupada considered to be something that he wrote. So they asked Satsvarup Maharaj to continue with the purports of the Mukundamala Stotra. And Satsvarup Maharaj, he requested, because by that time we had, originally there was, in the Sanskrit department, there was Pradumna, who Prabhupada, he donned as the Panditji. And then Pradumna, he taught just a few of us. We had regular Sanskrit lessons with him. Nitai, one Mataji named Anandini, and myself. We would sit and learn Sanskrit from a book that Prabhupada approved. And then Prabhupada took Pradumna away from us because he wanted Pradumna to travel with him so that he could get his writing done more quickly. And then Nitai came. And then all of a sudden in 1972, three or four devotees joined. Gopi Puranadana, Santosh, Jai Sachinandan, and Jagannath Das. And they all learned Sanskrit. So we had a very strong Sanskrit department at that time in the BBT. So Gopi Puranadana, he was the chief amongst all the Sanskrit editors. And he also did later he did Brihad Bhagavatamrita and other books. So he, along with Satsvarup Maharaj, completed the 53 slokas of Mukundamala Stotra. And all of you should read it because really the most beautiful slokas, and Prabhupada would often quote them. So that was the first article that Prabhupada gave in this Back to Godhead. And then in the next one, the next page, Prabhupada wrote 2 articles. One is called Obstacles on the Path of Devotion, and over here is called Scholars Deluded. Now, Obstacles on the Path of Devotion, this article describes from the very beginning of the evolution of the living entity, just as a minuscule particle. And Prabhupada explains that the number of living entities is infinitesimal, just like the number of atoms. That's how many living entities there are. And how they enter the material world and how they go through the different species of life. Finally, they come to the point of religiosity in the human form. And then they come to the point of aspiring for liberation. And all the different obstacles along the way of sense gratification, of being misguided by different philosophies, finally, of not understanding the real purpose of liberation. And even the liberated persons, they come down into altruistic activities rather than aspiring for spiritual activities. Finally, and then Prabhupada, he gives he points to the Canto 6, the 14th chapter, when Indra and Vritrasura are having their fight. How Vritrasura, who was born as a demon, was actually a great devotee. And Parikshit Maharaj couldn't understand that how could this demon be able to speak such high Vaishnava philosophy and eventually go back to Godhead. So Prabhupada explaining from there that it doesn't matter what type of birth you take in the human form. You simply, by good association and by proper study, you can attain the perfection of life by engaging only in spiritual activities. So Prabhupada in this very long article explains all of the obstacles that we as devotees have to be very careful of on our path back to Godhead. Then in the next article, Scholars Deluded, Prabhupada starts out with 111 of the Srimad Bhagavatam. Vyasadeva was depressed because even after he had compiled all of the Vedas and the Puranas, the Upanishads, the Agamas, everything, he was not satisfied internally. So his spiritual master Narada Muni began to explain to him about the glories of the name, the Leela, the Guna, and the beauty of the Supreme Lord, and told him to just write about the Supreme Lord, and we know that's the Bhagavad Purana. Then Vyasadeva, being enlightened by Narada Muni, went to his ashram near Badarik ashram, and was sitting in meditation to begin this great task. And there the Supreme Lord gave him a vision of Krishna himself and by his side Maya Devi. So the first sloka of Srimad Bhagavatam describes that even the great demigods, the great souls like Brahma and all the sages, even they become deluded and they cannot fully understand the Supreme Personality and all of his qualities. So Srila Prabhupada, very, very, in such a gentlemanly manner, he approaches a topic that's very controversial. And that was, at that time, the President of India was Dr. S. Radhakrishnan, who was a very highly educated South Indian Brahmin and considered one of the greatest Hindu and Sanskrit scholars. And he did a translation of Bhagavad-Gita. And one brahmachari went to visit Dr. Radhakrishnan, and Radhakrishnan gave him a copy of his Bhagavad-Gita. The brahmachari's name was Madan Mohan Brahmachari. Now Madan Mohan Brahmachari came back and spoke to Prabhupada that I'm reading this Bhagavad-Gita and there's so many incongruities in the explanations that Dr. Radhakrishnan is giving. So then Prabhupada began going through it. And Prabhupada, before he even starts his antagonism of Dr. Radhakrishna, he says that there is a well-known understanding among scholars that if you have an argument with a scholar, with an educated person, you never have to worry about revenge or being attacked by that person because he's intelligent. He'll listen to you, and in an intelligent manner, things can be understood. But as for a fool, you should not even make friendly relationships with a fool, because you never know what's going to happen with a fool. So Prabhupada offered all respects to Dr. Radhakrishna, and then he started his attack. He started with 934, Manmana Baba Mad Bhakto, Mad Yaji Mam Naras Kuru. Now it's considered the most important sloka in the Bhagavad-Gita, so important that Krishna repeated it twice, 934 and then 1865. Now, is that because Krishna forgot what he had said? No, it's because it's so important, those four things, to always think of me and worship me, offer your obeisances to me, offer your homage to me. So that's how important it is. So what Dr. Radhakrishna did was, he said in his translation and in his purport, it is not to Krishna to whom we must surrender, but to the unborn within Krishna. So Srila Prabhupada, not only in this Back to Godhead, but continuing to be continued in the next Back to Godhead, he goes through all of the different types. Now, Dr. Radhakrishna, he knew the whole philosophy, but he applied it to impersonalism. He knew all the 6 different symptoms of surrender, prapati, anukulya, pratikulya, everything. But he said everything must be done to the Brahman. And Srila Prabhupada, in his gentlemanly presentation, explains that it must be to a person, because everything Krishna says is mam, sarva dharmam paripraja, mam ekam saranam braja. So Srila Prabhupada, he takes the time, the effort, and the scholarly ability to defeat Dr. S. Radhakrishna, who was considered one of the greatest scholars of that time. So this was Prabhupada's greatness. Then, Srila Prabhupada, now you have to remember that this Back to Godhead was, Prabhupada wrote everything within 2 weeks. He got it in October, it was printed October 20th, so that means within 20 days, this was all written, typed, proofread, and then printed. On the last page, there's an article called Universal Citizens Forum. Now, there were many different schools of thought all over the world as to how government should be run. There was capitalism, democracy, socialism, communism, all the different types of isms that Prabhupada talks about. So in England, they made a Universal Citizens Forum, which is somewhat similar to the United Nations. It contained citizens from 42 different countries at the time, and they wanted to make a monogamous, all one type of government for the entire world. And they were going to hold their first elections. And these elections, no one was allowed to campaign, because, you know, during election time they have all these big campaigns and they give out gifts and they have rallies, and no one in the world was allowed to campaign. There were only the different people with their different qualifications, and whoever voted, they could only tick according to the qualifications of the person. That was the only way they were able to vote. So Srila Prabhupada, he took this principle of Universal Citizens Forum, and he combined it with the very end of Srila Prabhupada's introduction to Bhagavad-Gita. At the end, Srila Prabhupada, he quotes the Gita Mahatmya. He goes through different slokas written by Shankaracharya. The last sloka, you'll read it just before the list of the parampara. Eka shastram devaki putram gitam, eko deva devaki putra eva, eka mantras tasya namani yam, karmyapya ekam tasya devasya seva. So Srila Prabhupada, he recommended his own system of universal citizens forum. Yes, everything should be one. Everything should be the same throughout the entire world. There should be one scripture, Bhagavad-Gita. There should be one Supreme Lord with many names, but the name that we use is Krishna. There should be one song, that's the Maha Mantra, and Prabhupada explains there that there are many Vedas. There are Vedas in all the different countries. So Srila Prabhupada did not exclude other scriptures. But the culture, the one culture, is to develop, according to the different countries' Vedas, service to God. There should be one unit. That unit means the Varnashram. That everyone, according to their qualification, they should serve the one government, and that one government should give all of the facilities to the people for two things. One is for the maintenance of the body and the soul and the mind, so that they're peaceful and living comfortably, and the other is for spiritual development. So Srila Prabhupada, he went on, there were 10 different types of oneness, and he described the first 6, and then to be continued. So Srila Prabhupada was very busy writing. This is before he started Srimad Bhagavatam. And then, it was the first issue in 2 years. Another donor, Mr. Subodh Kumar Kapoor of Ramlal Kapoor and Sons, followed Mr. Sirkar's example and donated 1,000 copies for the November 20th issue. So this November 20th issue, here they've put some pictures here. I don't know if you can all see it. This is Srila Prabhupada speaking to one of the brothers of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, Lalit Prasad, in Bengal. I forget the name of the place, Birnagar, in Birnagar where he lives, where Bhaktivinoda Thakur's birthplace is. So Prabhupada was going to visit him because Birnagar was falling into degeneration, and Prabhupada offered that they would fix everything up, but they weren't interested. They wanted to keep control of the place. So this is the next issue. And this starts with a very famous article called Truth and Beauty. And on the bottom again, 1,000 copies donated by Sri Subodh Kumar Kapoor of Ramlal Kapoor and Sons, Bombay. So we tried to find out who is Subodh Kumar Kapoor and who are Ramlal Kapoor and Sons of Bombay. There were 2 that we could find. Of course, this was 70 years ago. It was hard to trace back that far. One was a textile manufacturer, Ramlal Kapoor, because Prabhupada was getting a lot of donations from the textile merchants and the multimillionaires. And the other was a publisher of spiritual books, all types of spiritual books. So which one was the donor, we're not sure, but there were 2 in Bombay with the same name. So this Truth and Beauty, because Srila Prabhupada, when he was writing his Back to Godheads, he would read the newspapers and find out what people were interested in reading about at that time. So there was an article, and that article was called Literary Lapses. And again, there was a very, very popular and very highly established Bengali gentleman. His name was Mr. Humayun Kabir. So possibly he was Muslim. That's a Muslim name? Yes. He was also the Minister of Education of India. And he was a great poet and scholar. He was educated at Exeter College in Oxford, in London, where he began writing his poetry. And his poetry, I tried to find it because why Prabhupada wrote about truth and beauty, I was trying to find which poem Prabhupada was writing about. But of all of his poetry, they only give one very famous poem. And that poem is very similar to what we read 2 weeks ago in the Vrindavan Bhajan, where Prabhupada talks about a list of names and he talks about froth on the sea. So I'm just going to read a few lines of it to see how similar Prabhupada and Kabir's thinking was. Those who were once dear are today only faint memories of the mind. Life's uneven road curves in and out, and suddenly they disappear beyond the bend. But love cannot live on fond regrets. So this is a poet speaking, exactly what Prabhupada was discussing. That now all of my loved ones, where are they now? They're just a list of names, just like froth on the sea, appearing and disappearing. So this topic of truth and beauty, because in the material world, truth and beauty are incompatible, because often truth is horrible. The truth that we see, what's going on in the world, is actually untruth. And the beauty that we see is also not real beauty. Nothing is real that is not eternal. We know that everything here lasts for some time. It's real, but only for some time. Everything in this world is temporary. So therefore, the truth and beauty of this world is not real truth and beauty. But the truth and beauty of the spirit soul is eternal and completely compatible. So Srila Prabhupada says that this incompatibility of truth and beauty, the philosophers and the great thinkers of many ages have been trying to combine the two. And he gave the example of Mahatma Gandhi, because Mahatma Gandhi's autobiography was experiments with truth. He was looking for the truth, and therefore he was trying to find truth in this world. What should one be working for? But Prabhupada explains that you won't find truth in the material world. Truth and beauty can only be found in the spiritual world. So then, for those of you who don't know the story, one gentleman fell in love with a beautiful girl, and the woman was not interested at all. So she wanted to teach him a good lesson. So she said, "You come back in 7 days, and certainly I will accept your proposal." So he waited for the 7 days, and within those 7 days, she took very strong purgatives and laxatives. And within 7 days, vomiting, passing so many loose stools, she kept all of those liquids in some pots. And her whole body became emaciated, her eyes sunk into her skull, and her whole body became blackish because of all of the sickness. So when the gentleman came back, well dressed, ready to meet the young woman, he saw this decrepit looking woman who opened the door, and he asked the whereabouts of where's the young lady. And she said, "I am that young lady." He said, "No, that's impossible." And then she explained to him that I have taken all of my beauty and kept those beauty liquids in pots. So you can go and enjoy those pots. So he went in, he was taken to the pots, and he nearly fainted from the horrible smell, and he ran away. So in this instance, she was teaching that beauty in this world is not real beauty. no, beauty in this world is just a temporary thing. So then Prabhupada, he purports this story, saying that both Kabir, he was trying to find beauty and some type of love and truth within this world, he could not find it because he was looking in the wrong place. And the editor, the person who was criticizing Kabir's poetry, he was also wrong, because never will you find in this world the combination of truth and beauty that go together. It's only in the spiritual world where truth and beauty are eternally existing that you can find the two always combined together. So this was Prabhupada's literary way of describing what real truth and beauty is. Then Prabhupada, he has a very, very, very long article here called Standard Morality. And in this article, Prabhupada explains that for one man's medicine, that's another man's poison. Because morality will change according to the social customs of the people. What's a social custom for a householder and what's morality for a businessman are two different things. Now, he gives the example of animal life. In animal life, there's no question of morality because the animals, they don't choose to follow laws. They're strictly under the stringent laws of material nature, and they're forced to act according to those laws. But there's one animal who's considered to be moral, and that's the dog. Because the dog is very faithful to its owner, to its master. So he is considered a moral animal because of his faithfulness. But then Prabhupada says, but that dog, he might be morally faithful to his master, but when he sees another dog, he becomes ferocious and can't stop howling because he's afraid that this dog will come and destroy his self-interests by coming into his territory. So he said, man is exactly the same way. They may appear to be moral, but if anyone comes and tries to in any way interfere with a person's self-interest, they will howl and they will become just as ferocious as a dog. So he says actual morality is when one follows the codes of the Supreme Lord. And then he begins to quote the different Niti Shastras of Chanakya Pandit. He said that one who sees all women as his mother, except for his wife, he is a moral person. One who sees all possessions just like garbage, he's a moral person. And the last one is one who treats others as he himself would like to be treated. He is a moral person. So we have all of the tenets given by Chanakya Pandit. And we have the example of how Chanakya Pandit lived. So Srila Prabhupada, in this long article, he explains that real morality means when we do everything for the satisfaction of the Supreme Lord according to his rules and regulations. So this was Prabhupada's summing up of real morality. He says that morality without religion is just a farce. And someone who tries to be moral without religion, there's no such thing, because without the laws of God, you don't know what real morality is. So then Prabhupada goes on with the scholars deluded. He continues, and we'll read here. The front page article in the November issue was Truth and Beauty. An editorial in the Times of India speculating on whether truth and beauty were compatible had opined that truth was not always beautiful, but often ugly and unpleasant. Abai disagreed. Truth is so beautiful that many sages, saints, and devotees have left everything for the sake of truth. But we are habituated to love untruth from time immemorial in the name of truth. Abai agreed, however, that mundane truth and beauty were incompatible. Not only was mundane truth not beautiful, it was not truth. And mundane beauty was not real beauty. To explain, Abai told a story. So I'll read the story because it's here. Once a man fell in love with a beautiful girl who tried to resist the man's advances. When he persisted, she requested that he wait for 7 days, after which she would accept him. During the next 7 days, the girl took a strong purgative and laxative and repeatedly passed stool and vomited. She stored the refuse in buckets. Thus, the so-called beautiful girl became lean, thin like a skeleton, and turned blackish in complexion, and the beautiful eyeballs were pushed into the sockets of the skull. The man appeared on the scene well-dressed and well-behaved, and asked the waiting girl, who was depressed in appearance, about the beautiful girl who called him there. The man could not recognize the waiting girl as the same beautiful girl whom he was asking for. The same girl, however, was in a pitiable condition, and the foolish man, in spite of repeated assertions, could not recognize her. It was all due to the action of the medicine only. At last the girl told the powerful man all the story of her beauty, and told him that she had separated the ingredients of her beauty and stored them up in the reservoirs. She also told him that he could enjoy the juices of beauty stored up in the reservoirs. The mundane, poetic, or the lunatic man agreed to see the juices of beauty, and thus he was directed to the store of loose stool and liquid vomit, which were emanating unbearable bad smell, and thus the whole story of beauty liquid was disclosed to him. Abai went on to assert that literature which did not describe the ultimate truth and beauty of the Supreme Person was no better than stool and vomit, even though it be presented as poetry and philosophy. In Standard Morality, Abai explained, morality is the standard of activity by which the supreme authority is satisfied. The scriptures contain moral codes prohibiting unholy sex relations, animal slaughter, intoxication, and gambling. Abai attributed Mahatma Gandhi's success as a public leader to his observance of these moral principles. Abai also praised the Vedic system of marriage. After the attainment of puberty, a woman wants a male, and if she is not married within that time and allowed to mix up with boys, it is quite natural that there is every chance of fall down either by the boy or the girl. Despite changing social conditions, Abai argued, you cannot indulge in unholy connection with the opposite sex just because the social conditions have changed, because unholy connection with woman is the beginning of all immorality. So, even in the Srimad Bhagavatam, Srila Prabhupada in various purports, he has described that actually before the girl, and we heard about this when Srila Prabhupada's father was trying to get Prabhupada's sisters married, and Prabhupada's mother threatened to commit suicide because the girl was already 12 years old and hadn't been married yet. Because a young girl, when she reaches puberty, she immediately will become attracted to a male. So therefore, it's recommended that she, even without living with the husband, the marriage is arranged before the age of puberty, so that there's no unholy connection between young girls and young boys. Can you tell me what time it is? 648. Okay, thank you. In Scholars Deluded, oh no, one thing that's happening just presently, which was quite surprising. You know, our Prime Minister Modi, he went to America, and they had a big state dinner for him. Now, usually state dinners in the foreign countries means meat eating, intoxication. But in honor of his religious principles, they had a purely vegetarian dinner at the White House, and instead of alcohol, they served non-alcoholic drinks. So this is the power of when one is really honest and truthful about his religious beliefs. It can turn a whole country into that type of living. So this is a great example for all of us, that we should not lower our standards. But before the temple was built, the two devotees went to the Arabian countries, the UAE, to collect donations. It was Gunarnava and Tribhuvanath, I think it was. And they went to different, of course it was all Muslim people at that time. There were no Indians working over there as it is now. There was no ISKCON over there. So they were trying to get a donation from one very wealthy Muslim man. And they were saying that we're building a school in India for poor children, and you please help us. So the Muslim, he had a doubt that maybe these were Hindus, although they were English. They were English-bodied. So he wanted to test them. So he invited them for dinner, and he served meat. And of course the devotees refused to take it, so therefore the man didn't give a donation. So then when they came back to Vrindavan, they asked Prabhupada, did they do the right thing? And Prabhupada said, you should have eaten the meat. And even Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati said that even if we have to serve them meat, just so they will come and listen. So, but of course these were very extreme examples. But we can see now, as an example of Prime Minister Modi, if we maintain our principles, then that'll have such an impact on the world that even they'll be willing to become vegetarian and give up their alcoholic drinks. In Standard Morality, Abhay explained, morality is the standard of activity by which the supreme authority is satisfied. Yes, I read that. In Scholars Deluded, Abhay presented a critical review of Dr. Radhakrishna's edition of Bhagavad-Gita, citing specifically the 34th verse of the 9th chapter, wherein Lord Krishna declares that one should always think of him and become his devotee. Dr. Radhakrishnan had commented, it is not the personal Krishna to whom we have to give ourselves up utterly, but the unborn, beginningless, eternal, who speaks through Krishna. Now, Srila Prabhupada eventually went to meet Dr. Radhakrishnan at his home when he was in Chennai. Around 1974, 1976. We were going to get a donation of property in Nellore, and then he went to Chennai, so he thought he would take the opportunity to meet Dr. Radhakrishnan. By that time, when Prabhupada went to see him, he was living alone with his sister, and he had gotten dementia. So when Prabhupada went to see him, Prabhupada began speaking to him, and very quickly Prabhupada could understand that nothing was registering. Anything Prabhupada was saying, he couldn't understand. Dr. Radhakrishnan, it wasn't going into his brain because he had gotten dementia. So Prabhupada stopped speaking, And then Dr. Radhakrishna, he just said to Prabhupada, "You please pray for me." So we have to be very careful how we use our brains. We have to use our brains in Krishna's service, otherwise they get taken away from us. So that's a very strong lesson for all of us, that when Prabhupada saw what had happened, because in this article, Prabhupada says that when one refuses to accept the personal feature of the Supreme Lord, Namam Duskrita Mudha, Naradama, he says that actually they're on the level of Jarasandha, Hiranyakashipu. They're actually demons because they're trying to cut out the personality of the Supreme Lord. So all of us have to very carefully train our minds to constantly meditate on the personal form of the Lord, and in the highest standard of morality, serve Him, and that way our minds will always remain sharp up to the last moment, just as Srila Prabhupada did. Although the obvious meaning of Bhagavad-Gita was that one should surrender to Krishna, the Supreme Person, impersonalists like Dr. Radhakrishnan obscured the direct meaning with their word jugglery. So this is the end of these descriptions of the two Back to Godhead magazines. And now we're going into a new section, because coming up, the disappearance day of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati usually falls in December, and then his appearance day usually falls in January. So this next section is Srila Prabhupada. On the appearance day of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, Abhay keenly felt separation from his spiritual master. He perfectly understood that Srila Bhaktisiddhanta's instructions were more important than his physical presence, and that, in fact, the spiritual master was present within his instructions. In this way, Abhay had always been with his spiritual master. Yet on this annual day, Abhay could not help feeling lost. He remembered how in 1932 he had been a Grihastha and a new disciple. At that time he had not been free to do as much service as now. Yet it had been in those years that he had been able to see his spiritual master, offer obeisances before him, eat the remnants of his prasadam, walk beside him, hear his voice, receive his personal glance. Abhay thought of their meetings together. So this is the anguish of a disciple, the disappearance of the spiritual master. There's the Vani and there's the Vapu. While the spiritual master is present, as far as possible we should try to have association with the Vapu of the spiritual master, try to render some personal service. If that's not possible, we get some instruction from the spiritual master and try to serve that instruction. Because the instructions of the spiritual master are non-different. He's present within his instructions. So those of us, let's say, even amongst Prabhupada's disciples, some of Prabhupada's disciples never even got to personally meet Srila Prabhupada. They were initiated by letter, or they were initiated by their temple president who gave them the mantras, gave them the sacred thread. They only got to hear Prabhupada on a tape in the ear. But by Prabhupada's instructions through his books, they remained very, very steady in their devotional service to Prabhupada. So now we have Srila Prabhupada lamenting that his spiritual master has been gone now. It was 1958, 1932 he took initiation, so nearly 20, 30 years. And he felt his spiritual master's presence through his instructions. And now, more than ever, he was able to engage in serving those instructions. So next week, we will, instead of the Jai Radha Madhava, we'll sing maybe the first 2 stanzas of the Viraha Astakam. That is, there's 8 stanzas, and each stanza has 8 lines. And these are the Prabhupada's outpouring of his feelings of separation to his spiritual master. So you can bring that next week and we'll sing that. Okay, thank you. Hare Krishna. Jai.